If your life was a musical, what would the marquee say?
Gayest show on earth. Full of gay entertainment. Gays are us. Gays united.
A gayical.
A gayical. Fashion and gays. Guy in pumps. Cross-dressing. I guess. I don't know.
Okay, I'm back up on my grind. You do you and I'm just gonna do mine. Okay, I'm back up on my grind. You do you and
Fuck you, pay me.
Oh.
What's going on, y'all? I'm McQueen, a 20-something androgynous millennial just trying to figure out my way in the world. Before you join my YouTube, I wanted y'all to get to know who I am. Who's McQueen? What makes me tick? What makes me laugh? Who is the person behind the YouTube? So, before you join and subscribe to my channel, join me on my journey as you get to know who is McQueen. I'm going to take y'all back to the beginning, where it all started, in Frankfurt, Germany. On April 12, 1991, Jerry and Wajana Reynolds gave birth to the baby boy, the heir to the throne, me. If I had to paint y'all a picture of what my childhood was like, think Rudy Huxtable. My father was just like Cliff Huxtable. You know, my mother was always bopping around the house. You know, I had a very, very my wife and kids experience. It was like the Proud Family. I had a rather easy time coming out to my parents because it was pretty much already apparent. So I didn't really have to, you know, go through the whole like, hey, I'm gay. My mom pretty much already knew. And when I told my dad, he was like, whatever floats your boat. And that was pretty much the only conversation we really had about it. And from then on, I just took off.
I think raising a gay child for me is just raising a child because you love your child and you have to accept them for who they are. And if they just happen to be gay, oh well, you just love them for who they are. They're gay, okay. That doesn't take away from your love for them or your hopes for them or anything like that. You always want the best for your children, regardless of whether they're gay or straight.
I have absolutely no real complaints about how I was raised. Everything about it was great. I lived in a 2-story, 4-bedroom house on a street with all white people. I was the only black kid on the goddamn block. Everything was great. My life was amazing. Until it wasn't. Somewhere around 5th or 6th grade, things had really just started to take a turn for the worse. My mother had really started to struggle with drugs and addiction, and it had really started to just ruined everything. You know, my mother, while she was on drugs, was almost unrecognizable. You know, you don't really understand just how powerful drugs are until you come into contact with somebody who struggles with addiction. My mother was very erratic, very angry, very unpredictable. You know, things around the house would start to go missing. My electronics, my Xbox, Christmas gifts, birthday gifts, money that was in cards would go missing. Money out of wallets would go walking away. Things would just start to disappear because my mother had to fund her habit. She had stopped working. You know, her appearance had drastically began to change. You know, my mother is a very healthy woman. She's a very healthy size. You know, she's always been very healthy in the way that she lives her life and in the way that she's built. And at a certain point in time, she had gotten down to like maybe 125 pounds. And my mother has never been that small. At one point in time, we were the same size, and I was like 13, 14 years old. So, you know, drugs had really just started to cripple the family. My sister stepped in to kind of take the brunt of that hurt for me, to try to shield me away from what was really going on. But it was very apparent what was going on. She did her best to step into that motherly role, but at the same time, my sister's only 11 years older than me. So how can somebody who's only a decade older than me really take on so much responsibility and pretty much stand in as an acting mother until my mother could finally get together? And this is something that my family struggled with for almost 10 years. Around my senior year, my mother had really started to get it. She really realized, you know, how much of my life she had missed. She really got her shit together. She got in school, you know, she went back to college. She was clean and sober. You know, she really worked hard to clean her life up. She went to rehab. You know, she had been to rehab in the past, but she had relapsed so many times. But this time she had finally got it right. She was working again. She was going back to school. She was on her way to her master's, and she was done using drugs. And we were back close again. You know, that was my mama. I love my mother. Me and my mother have the best relationship to this day, and I don't blame her for anything that you go through, because, you know, I understand that addiction is a sickness, and my mother was very sick, and she overcame that. That's her personal story of triumph, and I would never want to take that away from her, and I would never want to take that away from my life story, because it made me strong, it made me perseverant, it made me triumphant, it made me someone who is very strong. And I wouldn't take that away from my story, because it's such a part of my independence, and it's such a part of me finding who I am. I love my mother. She's like the dopest woman ever, and despite her addiction, despite everything we went through, despite all the missed moments, I wouldn't trade my mother for the world. My mom is dope, and it got really bad for me in high school. I was doing all the stuff that high schools probably shouldn't, you name it. I was sneaking out, I was skipping school, I was cutting class, I was doing drugs, I was hanging out with all the wrong people, I was having sex, I was hanging out with crowds way older than me. I was just way too fast and way too grown for my age.
It was challenging because when he was growing up, he used to like to fight. People couldn't say anything to him that he didn't like, because he would snap.
It wasn't until I really started to realize my talents and get into the arts that I really started to slow down. You name it, in high school, I did it because it kept my mind busy and it kept me on the straight and narrow. I did show choir, I did color guard, I did cheerleading, you name it. All-star cheerleading was like the shit for me. I had so much fun being a cheerleader. Like, you couldn't tell me shit when I was cheerleading, okay? Somewhere around 2007 is when, like, I knew that social media was going to blow up and I was going to be a big thing. MySpace was all the rage in like 2007, and that's when like my art and my photography really started to hit the ground running. I invented like an alternate persona that I called Ja'Cory Notorious, and the reason why I did that is because on MySpace at the time, I didn't want my parents to be able to find it. So I didn't want to put Ja'Cory Reynolds, and I didn't want people from school to be able to find me easily. So I came up with, what would be like a name that would allow me to express myself through my art, because people were always getting a hold of like my photography and then like going around school and showing everybody, and then it was like the talk of the town because my photography at the time was, you know, racy or push the envelope. So I wanted to create like a MySpace or like a persona where I could be me and not have to worry about, you know, the whole school finding out. So I invented the persona Ja'Cory Notorious, and I just started sharing like my photography with MySpace, and that's when like my internet popularity really started. On MySpace, I had like 20,000-30,000 friends at one point. Like, my MySpace was booming. I was like really running home to get on MySpace. At the time, you really didn't have a whole lot of like internet on your phone at the time, so I was using like the school computers and like hacking the system so I could get on MySpace. Like, my MySpace really just took my internet persona to the next level, and that's really where my confidence was built. That's where my attitude was built. That's where the foundations of Ja'Cory McQueen were really made when I was Ja'Cory Notorious. Like, if it wasn't for like Ja'Cory Notorious in my MySpace, like, I don't think that I would have ever really got to my ultimate dream of wanting to be a blogger, because Ja'Cory Notorious is where it all started for me. And like, becoming Ja'Cory Notorious and getting into like my photography and, you know, being an internet persona, because that's really where, you know, posting statuses and things of that nature really started to gain its traction. Then Twitter came along a little after that, and I originally had like a really big following on all of my original platforms. Like, my MySpace was booming, my Twitter had like 10K at one point, and then my fucking ex-boyfriend deleted all of my social media platforms, all of them. All that shit's gone. So at the time when I wanted to remake Ja'Cory Notorious and like remake my persona, I remember like Facebook would not accept Ja'Cory Notorious, and I was pissed. I was like, I want to be Ja'Cory Notorious, and Facebook would not accept Notorious as a last name. So I kept thinking, like, who could I be? What name would make sense? Like, I couldn't pick a name for myself at the time. And I remember Alexander McQueen had just passed away, and I remember like Googling it because I had come across one of his photo shoots that David LaChapelle had did, and I remember just being so immersed and so inspired by his work. It was so edgy, it was so freaky, it was so out of the box, it was so out of the norm, and that's exactly how I felt. I felt like I had finally found something that connected with me as someone who was a creative in Little Chester, Virginia, because every time I would create art, it would cause a stir at school. Every time I would do a photo shoot, it was always like a big deal. No matter what it was, anything that I would do was always so controversial. So I really connected with Alexander McQueen. And I remember on Facebook I couldn't put Jacory Notorious as my last name. So I immediately thought, well, who could I use? Who could I use? And that's where it was born. That's where it all started. Jacory McQueen. That was it.
I love you, I love you too, darling.
Okay, the song.
You gotta leave because the trade coming over.
Huh?
You gotta leave because the trade coming over.
What's the trade? What's that?
My man, honey. The trade is coming over.